Buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the second day of the doctoral seminar of the Charles V Award on the principle of solidarity. After the day of yesterday, that was kind of like a training and an introduction to start discussing this very important topic that we're going to be addressing in this seminar. So, after those excellent presentations, um, first we heard Ruben, and then Marie, and then we heard Pablo. So I think that served us to set the grounds and to get us started in what we're going to work today. Today we have JESÚS BAIGORRI. He wasn't able to come here in person for different reasons, but he's with us online. He's going to be chairing the first panel. So, JESÚS BAIGORRI JALÓN. Up until not that long ago, he was a professor at the Department of Translation and Interpretation of the University of Salamanca. He holds a degree in history and a PhD in translation and interpretation. He was also a secondary school teacher in Salamanca at the Fray Luis de Leon High School and at the Vicente Cañada Blas School in London. He was a minute taker and interpreter at the United Nations, minute taker in 1989-1991 and interpreter 1992-1999. And he's a founding member of the Alfaqueque Researcher Group. He's the author and editor of dozens of books on interpretation and translation and numerous articles. He's a lecturer and guest speaker on translation and interpreting topics at various universities at national and foreign professional institutions. He has been a member and a collaborator of this Yuste Foundation. He's a restless soul. He's always launching projects and publications, presentations, and I think retirement was good for him because it allowed him to develop all those interests that he has. He's one of the forefathers of this doctoral seminar. I remember perfectly a lunch that was the moment when this seminar, the idea of the seminar started. He has also worked here as an interpreter, but he was a very special interpreter because while he was interpreting, he contributed with his ideas and he improved this project along the years. And he's also a friend. I think my words make it clear that he's my friend, and I think it's a great honor to have him here, even though he's with us remotely. He's really sorry not to be here in person, but well, at least we have this, and we hope it works. So, Jesus, the floor is yours. You're chairing this panel.
Um, Good morning to you all from cyberspace. I would have liked to be there with you. It is much more emotional and much better to be face to face, but it hasn't been possible for a series of reasons that would be long to explain. This day, we commemorate the International Day. I hope you're hearing me all right. I'm not sure. The International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And I usually mention the day when we are living, and this is particularly suitable, perhaps because women are not precisely the best treated in migratory movements. And this is the issue that Eva Krejcova is going to deal with in a few moments. If you allow me, since I haven't no other opportunity to participate in the seminar except this one, I wish to start obviously by thanking the two directors of the course, or rather the seminar, Juan Carlos Moreno and Teresa Freixas, whom I have met many times. Particularly, I would say that my relationship with Juan Carlos goes back to a very important moment when we went to Moscow to present the results of of the first actually doctoral seminar in the Gorbachev's Foundation. I was there. There is a microphone that is open and that you should close. I was there. I remember being there with Miguel as well. In Moscow is where I met Juan Carlos for the first time, probably close to 20 years ago, because I started cooperating with the foundation 21 years ago now. There are a couple of things that I wish to say as an introduction to the paper we're going to listen right now, which have to do with migration. And they refer to the two dimensions of time and space. Migrations are absolutely natural to human beings. We have always been moving around, and we are moving around all the time. Yesterday, in the presentations of the previous doctoral students, mention was made of the fact that they have traveled around, and that is the case also of Eva, who has studied in her country, in Prague, but also in Princeton, in Paris, in Montreal, in Cambridge right now. So she's been moving around all the time, as we human beings do. Migration is then a natural phenomenon for humankind in general. But moving has an element of scale, and distance is something that has changed and is changing continuously while we speak. I mean, distance cannot be conceived the same several centuries ago as we conceive it now. And distance is not only measured in miles, it is measured in feelings and in other dimensions, I would say. One suggestion to all the listeners of this presentation by Eva is to think of their own family tree very quickly. I mean, go back 2 generations, to the generation of your parents and to the generations of the generation of your grandparents, and try and see where your grandparents were born, where your parents were born, where they lived, where they moved, where you have moved, etc. So you will probably have an idea of the meaning of movement, of migration, and of the fact that we are all, as human beings, we are all hybrid individuals. There's no purity in any of us. I mean, we are the result of evolution from time immemorial, and that is the case all over the place, not just here in Europe. In a way, the idea of the violence against women is quite appropriate for a seminar on Europe, because after all, Europa, the Phoenician princess, was raped by Zeus, the Greek god. So she was a subaltern woman from a foreign territory, or a territory that does not belong to Europe right now. And being a woman, she created a new line of succession in a Hellenic island, but then in other parts as well. It is an issue of gods, of Greek gods, and it is an issue of Greek culture in a mixture, in a hybridity with other territories, the Near East, for instance. So this would probably be important to take into account when we think of the attitudes towards migrants that Eva has studied in depth, or is studying in depth in her PhD research, and she will explain, her quantitative methods, etc., in detail in a moment. But I wanted to mention these things in order for you to have that idea in mind. How we should understand migration and how we should look at migrants that do not belong necessarily to what now is considered to be Europe, or even in a smaller dimension, the European Union, which is not exactly from the Atlantic to the Urals, as geographically was understood, at least conventionally in the old days. I may have one or two words to add after the presentation. I don't want to take any more time in this introduction. I think I have more or less gleaned some of the details of Eva's career. And the only thing I want to say is that she's going to speak about immigration policies and attitudes towards immigration in contemporary Europe. Dobrino, Eva, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for your introduction and amazing insights, and for introducing me as well. Thank you. So I'm very happy to open up this morning, and as a start, I would like to obviously thank the Foundation for the opportunity to present my research, but also for organizing this event despite the difficult circumstances. I also want to congratulate my colleagues who presented yesterday, and I look very much forward to 2 more days full of presentations and discussions. So as Professor mentioned, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Cambridge, and my dissertation is about attitudes towards immigration in Europe. And what I do in particular is that I look on attitudes in Central and Eastern Europe, and I compare them with Western Europe. So this is the focus of my PhD. In the paper that I'm presenting today, and I'm preparing for the Carlos V Award, I actually look at one of the facets of attitudes towards immigration, and what I actually try to see in this paper is how attitudes towards immigration relate to immigration policies. So let me start with a brief introduction. Yes. So in 2016, commenting on the arrival of asylum seekers in Europe, the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, said, "We are facing the biggest refugee crisis, the refugee and displacement crisis of our time. Above all, this is not just a crisis of numbers, it's also a crisis of solidarity." In Europe, we may understand this crisis of solidarity during the refugee crisis, but also when it comes to migration more generally, in 2 main dimensions. And this was a little bit mentioned already during yesterday. So the first dimension is the solidarity with immigrants and with refugees, the lack of which can lead to unprecedented human tragedies. And the second one is the solidarity between the EU member states when it comes to sharing resources and cooperating on solutions. However, national governments are faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, they are aware that solidarity at the supranational level is indispensable for effectively responding to the challenges that the refugee crisis and immigration can bring. All member countries would benefit from coordinating humanitarian protection for refugees and avoiding the cost that result from unregulated refugee flows. On the other hand, though, politicians often assume, at least in their discourse, that it is politically infeasible to accept more refugees or adopt less restrictive immigration policies. they believe that such liberalization would induce public backlash. In the light of this dilemma, my paper searches to examine whether more liberal policies indeed lead to public backlash or not. So it asks how to understand the relationship between immigration policies and attitudes towards immigration. To answer this question, in the paper I track changes in immigration policies and attitudes towards immigration in 20 European countries over more than 25 years. And my today's presentation proceeds as follows. So first, I outline the theoretical and conceptual framework of my research. And second, I introduce very briefly the data that I'm using. Third, I present the results. And finally, I conclude with an overview of the main findings and their implications for future research and policy making. So let's start with the theoretical framework. So one of the central concepts in my paper are political attitudes. So just very briefly, how I understand political attitudes, I take the definition of Stutzel from 1963, and I see political attitudes as stances or beliefs that individuals hold towards a range of societal issues, social groups, ideologies, or worldwide views. So this definition actually considers attitudes as measurable and as quite specific, in contrast to notions such as values, for instance. Political attitudes can be influenced by several things, and I think in the literature what we find the most often is the early socialization, the individual socioeconomic characteristics, and the political and social environment individuals live in. And my focus in this paper is actually on the last mentioned. So I take into account the external environment, which is a particularly fruitful approach for studying country-level longitudinal and evolution over time. So when it comes to understanding attitudes towards immigration, there are two major contextual explanations at the national level. They both are built on the theory of group threat, and they actually deal with two different dimensions of this group threat. One is with regards to economic conditions. So this part of the theory argues that microeconomic decline accentuates competition between migrants and locals, which then leads to more negative attitudes towards immigration. So it's really linked to economic decline and more negative attitudes. And the second explanation adopts a more ethnocentric approach, and it postulates that if locals perceive immigrants as a threat to their social cohesion, this is linked to the number of immigrants in the country, then they can adopt a more negative attitudes towards immigration. So it's really economic conditions and share of immigrants in the country. In my study, I take these two factors into account, but I propose to focus on another aspect, which is public policies. This builds on studies that have explored the influence of laws and policies on tolerance of ethnic minorities and on attitudes towards other minorities such as gays and lesbians. Another definition in my paper, or something that I need to actually define, is what I consider as migration policies. So migration policies in my paper are actually all the rules that national states define and enact with the objective of affecting the volume, origin, direction, and internal composition of migration flows. And because I focus on immigration policies, this is actually the same definition, but laws that deal with immigration through different legal channels. If we were to sketch the main traits of immigration policies in post-war Europe, we could divide it into two main periods. The first period is between 1950s and 1980s, and it can be viewed or called an accelerated liberalization. And then the second period is since 1990s, where the liberalization actually decelerated, but not completely stopped. So I will just very briefly walk you through what happened between 1950s and 1980s. I'm sure that you are aware of most of the things, but just to present some context. So the liberalization of immigration policies after the Second World War was actually fueled by labor demand for reconstruction of Europe. It was characterized in the 50s by labor agreements between destination countries in Western Europe, principally Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Austria, and sending countries in the Mediterranean, initially Italy, Portugal, Greece, and later on Turkey, Morocco, or Tunisia. An important event, obviously, was also the establishment of a groundbreaking refugee protection system in 1951. Then after the 1973 oil crisis, the economic recession and the economic recession that followed the oil crisis, we actually see that most European countries stopped actively recruiting immigrants and also tried to encourage the return of some of the immigrants, for instance, through financial incentives. However, at the same time, they expanded migrants' political and socio-economic rights to family reunification, and acquisition of citizenship. So in total, the liberalization of policies actually didn't stop. It may seem as that Europe was shutting its door because it wasn't actively recruiting immigrants anymore, but it at the same time provided those rights to immigrants that were already in the country. And then the second period, since 1990s until today, actually. So we observe a relatively higher proportion of restrictive policies, but at the same time, most countries continue to liberalize their immigration policies, despite their political discourse that may sometimes give the impression that this is not the case. European countries since the 1990s have taken measures to increase border controls, restrict family reunification, and limit the number of asylum seekers. But at the same time, the liberal policy still prevailed. So countries continued to expand temporary labor agreements, refugee protection programs, and migration opportunities for students and highly skilled workers. So what we see is that it's actually still, there are like more liberal policies, but they can be also more selective. And one last thing, last but not least, is the establishment of the Schengen area, obviously, which opened up borders inside of Europe. When it comes to solidarity and immigration in the European Union, it has been already mentioned that solidarity represents one of the fundamental principles of European integration. Nevertheless, in the area of immigration, it takes different form depending on whether we talk about intra-European migration or international migration. So with regards to intra-European migration, the solidarity principle has been employed reciprocally to ensure equal treatment of EU citizens in all member states. However, the principle of solidarity is applied only to a certain extent to international immigrants and asylum seekers. When it comes to international immigration, the European Council has committed to the fair treatment of third country nationals, but only if they reside legally in their host countries. When it comes to refugees, we can take the example of Dublin regulation, which actually limits the sharing of responsibility among the EU member states. this allocation rule has been criticized for creating a disproportionate burden for the external border countries of the European Union. So when you look, for instance, at the Dublin regulation, you see that it presents a classic problem of international commitment and cooperation. So once again, we are back to the dilemma that I presented in the introduction, that most countries know that they would benefit from cooperation, but at the same time, they prefer to free ride and accept as little refugees as possible because they fear public backlash. And this brings us to the question, what are the possible public responses to immigration policies? So most generally, we can classify or see two types of responses. The first one is that we would observe the change in the same direction. So we would see that public attitudes and policies, like policy openness or restrictiveness, evolve in the same direction. This assumption is actually built on theory that claims that public policies have the power to change social norms and influence public perceptions of different groups. Indeed, previous research has shown that social norms and group constructions transmitted through public policies concerning sexual minorities, as I already mentioned, did influence public attitudes towards those groups. So building on this insight, my first hypothesis is actually that public attitudes towards immigration are positively associated with changes in immigration policies. And what I mean by positively here is actually in quantitative approach, so it means that it evolves in the same direction. So it can evolve towards more liberal or less liberal policies and attitudes, but positive means same direction. But then we also have the second possibility, which is that changes in public policies actually provoke a disapproving reaction from the public. So far, the notion of immigration backlash has been mostly used to describe an adverse public response to rising numbers of immigrants. However, recent research has shown that the actual share of immigrants in the country may not be as important for the public as is the feeling of being in control of who is allowed into the country. This can be particularly relevant for immigration policies at the EU level, because in this case, citizens can perceive a greater distance between themselves and the policymakers. And therefore, my second hypothesis is that immigration policies introduced as part of countries' membership in the European Economic Area or Schengen area are negatively associated with public attitudes towards immigration. So here it means negatively associated, that they would actually evolve in the opposite direction. So we would see that, for instance, if the policies introduced were more liberal, the public would move towards more negative attitudes towards immigration. So I will very briefly present the data that I'm using. So to measure public attitudes towards immigration, I actually use two surveys, or one is a survey, the second one is actually a measure. So the survey I'm using is the European Social Survey. It covers the period from 2002 to 2018, and there are two questions that I'm using. Both of them have kind of the same wording, so it's about allowing immigrants into the country. But one of them is concerned with international immigration, and the second one with intra-European immigration. And the second measure I'm using is the Mass Ideology in Europe measure. It was developed in 2019, and it provides country-level estimates. So the ESS is at the individual level, whereas this measure is at the aggregate level. In countries in Europe between 1990 and 2016, and one of the reasons I'm using it is because it covers a longer period, so it's interesting to see what also happens during the 1990s, and also because when I compare it with what I see in the ESS, it actually follows a very similar pattern. So I think it's relevant to use both. And it's interesting to know that it is similar to those extra European migration attitudes. So it's basically measuring this attitudes towards extra European migrants. To track changes in immigration policies, I used the determinants of international migration policy data. So this is data that includes all immigration policies, or all migration policies actually, that took place between 1965 and 2014. I only use the immigration policies, but it includes also immigration policies. And this data classifies changes with regards to their restrictiveness or openness, and also whether it's a major change or rather a fine-tuning, so there's this range. I would like to note that it is a relative measure, so it doesn't actually assess the overall restrictiveness or openness of a policy. It's really about whether the change to the status quo was towards a more or less open policy. And then for the contextual indicators, I use to measure immigration, or like the share of immigrants in the country, I use the World Bank country-to-country estimates. And to measure the economic conditions in the country, I use the real GDP per capita from the Medicine Project database. So let's move to the results. So I actually divide the results section into two parts. In the first part, I present the general within country evolution of attitudes towards immigration and immigration policies. So this is at the aggregate level. And in the second part, I take advantage of the fact that some major immigration policies were introduced during the ESS field work. And this allows me to actually compare individual attitudes towards immigration immediately before and after the introduction of the policy. So it allows me to see it in greater detail, but also potentially to see the causal relationship between the two. So for the general analysis, I first look at the two factors that were already mentioned in the literature, so the economic conditions and the share of immigrants. So this figure actually plots the evolution of share of immigrants and attitudes towards immigration. I would like to say that the share of immigrants is actually not an absolute number, so it's not comparable between countries. I rescaled it to vary between 0 and 1 to actually allow to follow the evolution over time. And the attitudes towards immigration, they stay on the same scale that varies between -2 and +2. The black line is the share of immigrants, and the gray line are the average attitudes. And I think what is interesting here to see is that the share of immigrants quite steadily increases over time in most of the countries, whereas when it comes to attitudes, we actually see a lot of variation, which points towards some period effects. And what we also do not observe is that in countries where the number or the share of immigrants increases, we do not observe that public attitudes would become more negative. So this doesn't actually confirm the argument that a higher share of immigrants would necessarily lead to more negative attitudes towards immigration. It is more in line with research that has shown that contact with immigrants in the long term can lead to higher openness towards immigration. But in any case, it doesn't really explain the variation in public attitudes, so I'm moving to the GDP. So this figure is the same as the previous one, but instead of the share of immigrants, it shows the economic situation in the country. What we see once again is that in most countries since the 1990s until 2008, the GDP steadily increases. The 2008 is actually an interesting moment from the analytical point of view because it's when the economic crisis happened, and we see like more or less significant drop in GDP in the countries. But what we also observe is that after the economic crisis, in most of the countries, attitudes towards immigration became more negative. So this may confirm at least partly the hypothesis about the economic situation. We see that probably the negative reaction to economic condition or the economic situation is more linked to short-term crisis or changes in the economic situation rather than to the over state of the economy. But once again, whereas the economic situation is relatively stable in most of the countries, the attitudes varies quite a lot. So I'm moving to focus on my research, which is actually the association between immigration policies and attitudes towards immigration. So this figure plots the evolution of mass attitudes as measured by the mass ideology index and of attitudes towards immigration over time, so since 1990 to 2014. I would also like to say, so I should have said it before, but higher number, or like higher number on the scale indicates a greater openness towards immigration. So if we see that the line actually goes up, it means that the public becomes more open, and when it goes down, it means that they have a more negative view of immigrants. So here we see the two, just like next one next to the other, and what we observe here is that in the majority of countries, the two indicators actually follow a highly similar pattern. This is particularly the case in Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. And we also see that in some cases, for instance in Italy, the changes in migration policies actually precedes the changes in attitudes. However, this is still just an observation, and I then move to the second part to see this in more detail. But this is what we observe on the overall. And I replicate this with the ESS data just to see what happens if we replace it by just specifically attitudes towards immigration from outside of Europe, and it yields very similar results. What I then move to is that I want to see what happens if the major policy introduced in a given year was an EU-related policy. So the red dot actually indicates the years when the only major policy introduced that year, only major immigration policy, was an EU-related immigration policy. And this can actually be related to intra-European immigration or like intra-European migration, but it can also be a change that aligns national law with the EU law, such as the adaptation of visa regime or the redefinition of detention grounds. And what I'm interested in here is to see whether if the immigration policy was EU-related, whether we observe a public backlash or not. And what I think this figure indicates is that we actually do not observe public backlash. In this case, we see that most of the time, if the immigration policy was more open, the public actually moved into the same direction, and sometimes the public became more open, even if the policy was actually more restrictive. So there is definitely not any public backlash. On the contrary, we see that even policies that were introduced from the EU level can induce a positive change in attitudes towards immigration at the national level in the States. I once again replicate this, but this time with the European Social Survey data on intra-European migration, just to see whether the results would be the same, and this is the case. So this was the first part of my paper, where I actually looked at the overall evolution, and in the second part, what I do is that I looked in more detail in some of the parts that, like some of the suggestions from the first part. I would like to say just a few words about the method that I used here. So I'm actually looking at immigration policies that took place during the European Social Survey fieldwork. The European Social Survey is a survey that runs every other year from 2002 to 2018, the most recent one. And the fieldwork lasts from between a month to 5 months, depending on the country. And what I did is actually I identified all major immigration policies that took place during the fieldwork. In the end, so I started with 178 policies, but in the end I ended up with just 4 because I also needed the number of individuals who were interviewed before and after the introduction of the policy to be substantive enough for me to obtain a comparative sample. So the 4 policies that actually filled all these criteria in the end were those 4 that I'm going to talk about very briefly. 2 of them are more restrictive and 2 of them are more liberal, which is, I think, quite interesting for what I want to see. So the first 2 are more restrictive, and the first one is the emergency amendments to the Asylum Act that took place in Switzerland in 2012. This is actually a highly dramatic period for Switzerland, I would say. So in 2012, Switzerland experienced the highest number of asylum applications since 1990. And the government actually presented this as a crisis and decided to speed up the process by giving priority to application that could be rejected without further evaluation. So it's a restrictive policy that was introduced in a time that was presented as an emergency. The second one are also with regards to asylum seekers. This is a policy that took place in Ireland in 2009, and it restricted the access of asylum seekers to welfare benefits. It's obviously also considered as more restrictive policy. The third is actually a group of laws that were all adopted on the same day, the 13th of November 2008 in Sweden. And all the changes are considered as more liberal except for one, but there were really 7 laws, major laws introduced during this time, all of them except for one more liberal, and this includes work permits granted to family members of migrants, workers receiving the same social rights as natives, 2-year work visa linked to employer demand, no skill selections, really just liberalizing policies. And finally, the fourth is a policy change that took place in Slovenia in 2010, and it allowed early access to free legal aid for asylum seekers, and it's also considered as more liberal. And these are the results for this part of the analysis. So I show the two more restrictive policies on the top, so Switzerland and Ireland, and the two more liberal policies down below for Sweden and Slovenia. And what we see here is, so the scale is the same as previously, so a higher score indicates more open attitudes, and a lower score indicates more negative attitudes towards immigration. The vertical line, the vertical red line, actually indicates the exact day when the policy was introduced. And on your left-hand side, I show attitudes 1 month and 2 weeks before the introduction of the policy. And on the right-hand side, these are attitudes immediately after the introduction of the policy, like 2 weeks after that, and a month after that, like from 2 weeks to a month after that. And what we see here is that for the policies that were more restrictive, so in Switzerland and Ireland, the public attitudes actually moved towards more negative attitudes, at least in the short term in Switzerland, and what seems to be a rather long-term change in Ireland. Whereas for the more liberal policies, we see this jump towards greater openness towards immigration. In Sweden, it's not such a huge jump, but I have to say also that Sweden has a very open to attitudes towards immigration, so there's like not much room to move towards in Sweden, but still we see a small effect. Actually, the measure varies from between -1 to 2, so a change of 0.4 is, I think, can be considered as quite substantive. So to conclude my presentation, my project examined this relationship between public attitudes towards immigration and immigration policies. And I think one of the main findings of my paper is that the assumption that liberal policies would lead to public backlash is actually not confirmed. What we see, on the contrary, is that more liberal policies are associated with greater openness towards immigration, the public, including policies that were introduced as part of countries' membership in the European Union or Schengen area. And the evidence from this second part of my results that looked on the introduction of policies in more detail actually show a possible causal relationship between policy introduction and attitudes. I believe that this is in line with, first of all, previous research on public policies as instruments to actually change or influence social norms, but also with more recent research on the preferences of European citizens when it comes to allocation of refugees. So this is an experimental research that was done where people were asked whether they prefer a fair allocation of refugees, which means that each member state would receive a fair share of the total applications, or whether they prefer the status quo. And the majority of citizens in the European countries, they actually prefer the fairness, so the fair allocation of refugees, even if it means that their country would receive a higher number of refugees. So this is one of the research, I think, like one of the, that my research is in line with. And the second one is actually a recent research on how the trades unions' rhetoric of solidarity towards immigrants influenced attitudes towards immigration of the trades union members. So I would like to maybe conclude with this and open the ground for discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Eva. Vamos a ver si recuperamos en imagen al profesor Baigorri, que no sé, en principio sé que estaba escuchando, pero no le veíamos, para que pueda comentar tu paper. Jesús, ¿nos oyes? Sí, ahora te vemos y te oímos. Vale.
Vale.
Adelante.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your excellent presentation. It has been much more, I mean, it has been much clearer to me through your oral presentation. I mean, it's always better because you present it in a very active manner. There are a few questions that I would like to, well, questions or comments, and comments. First of all, have you had any different views, taking into account the perspective of living in Prague, living in Paris while studying Sciences Po, living in Princeton, living in Cambridge, regarding migration? I mean, as a personal experience, does this have an influence in your views, your personal experience, regarding, for example, how the Czech Republic deals with migrants, or how post-Brexit Britain deals with migrants, or how you had to cope with a student visa to get into Princeton, or whatever. I mean, or how you felt in Paris regarding migration, multicultural society, etc. Since you have been involved in your previous training in languages and in intercultural communication, to what extent are you going to take into account the influence of languages, shared languages, shared cultures in the attitudes of people regarding migrants? As a way of example, in Spain, for instance, a lot of caregivers for the elderly come from Latin American countries nowadays. They are usually better received because they share the language and they don't have any language barrier. And they share many cultural elements too. So this is a point that I would like you to comment on. So is there a different social perception depending on the language spoken or the culture that the migrants have? Are, I don't know, Slovaks treated differently when they come to your country than, I don't know, Moroccans, for instance, simply for reasons of vicinity, in culture, etc. Are you planning to check among your sources the International Organization of Migrations? Because when I was dealing with issues of intercultural relations and interpreting, etc., among migrants here in Spain, I found a lot of material in its headquarters in Geneva. I wonder whether, I mean, it's probably everything accessible in digital format these days. But anyway, it's just a question that I'd like to be answered if possible. Are you planning to introduce any sort of cartographic elements, maps, even mental maps of people? I mean, the Mediterranean as a great mass grave of migrants, for instance. I mean, from a radical geography point of view, that would be a quite interesting element. I mean, only last night, a number of people have died trying to cross from Calais to the British island islands in you know, in a makeshift boat or whatever, or in a dinghy boat, or I heard the news this morning. So these things, I mean, the jungle, what is called the jungle in Calais, is that something that would deserve some representation in terms of cartography or even images in your research? That would probably add an interesting element, maybe. I know your research is mostly quantitative, and I'm very grateful for the prudence in which you point out that correlation has not an equivalence with causality. You have been very prudent, and I appreciate that. But I think you have pointed it out more, I mean, in my view, quite clearly today, rather than what I sort of perceived when reading your paper. So are you interested at all in considering the linguistic and cultural contact of migrants with authorities in the receiving countries, and the relationship between EU legislation and, for instance, the 64/2010 directive on the use, the obligation of having interpreting services in criminal lawsuits in all European Union countries? Are member states adopting, or are all member states adopting that kind of legislation, and to what extent that has a bearing on the perception, political perception? Is there any possibility of gleaning information from the press and the terminology used by the press regarding migration? I mean, for instance, this Teun van Dijk has very good material on that, he has studied particularly the press here in Spain, and I think in other countries too, but I mean, I've read some of his things here in Spain, where he was, or he is still a visiting professor in Catalonia. I mean, it may sound like a Niagara of questions, but it's not just a Niagara of questions, it's also a Niagara of comments, which are intended to be very encouraging. And I feel also encouraged by the probably emerging idea that the more liberal, the better. I mean, you know, in my own conception of migration and in my own view of how we should approach the issue of migrants, be it asylum seekers, be it refugees. I mean, there are so many areas in the world that are these days factories of exiles, that, and many of them are really yearning and longing to arrive in Europe, sometimes as a stepping stone to cross over to the Americas, mostly to the United States. But anyway, I mean, there are some steps as well. I mean, some people arrive in Greece and they always try to cross another border, trying to approach Germany, for instance, and in some other cases they want even to go further and cross the Channel and arrive in Britain, and perhaps because they think that in Britain, then they may hop over to the States, which is for many of them the ideal utopia. I don't know if it is with good reason or not. Anyway, these are parts of their yearnings. I don't know. I mean, I may have other elements as the debate develops, but I don't want to monopolize now the floor any longer. But I will be glad to listen to your elaboration on these questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I?
Yeah, please. And if you have questions, just please raise your hand so I can give you the floor on behalf of Jesus later. So one over there. Yeah. Please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your comments and suggestions. I think I will maybe start from the end and progress towards the beginning of your comments. But I totally agree with the importance of the linguistic and culture dimension, and also the discourse that surrounds immigration. One thing that I think is a bit complicated in my paper is that I have really a lot of countries and a long period. So it would be maybe too much to do it for the overall analysis, but I think it would be very, very interesting to do it for the 4 case studies that I present in the second part of the paper, because there I could really elaborate on those dimensions, and also to look at, I already did it a little bit for myself, to look how the policy changes were presented in the press. But I think, yeah, the paper would definitely benefit from including this. So thank you very much for this. I could also add cartographic elements, as you mentioned. I know how to use the software, so I could definitely do some my own maps. Maybe I'm not really sure what exactly this would include. I could, for instance, include all the descriptive statistics that I didn't present during the presentation, but that are in the paper. Maybe it would be more useful to see it on the map than just like a graph of figures. Is this something that you had in mind?
Walls, for instance, walls that are being erected, for instance.
Yeah, this is amazing. Yeah, great. Thank you. This is very good. Yes. Okay. And maybe even refugee camps and okay. Can you maybe just once again or like elaborate a little bit more on what you meant by looking into the International Organization of Migration, like what exactly you had in mind? Because I think the sound was a bit low and I couldn't really hear you very well.
I couldn't hear you quite well right now. Can you repeat it? What you just said? I mean, the volume has been turned down for you as well. Can you repeat?
Okay, yes. Yeah, I wanted to ask whether you could elaborate on what exactly you had in mind when you talk about looking into the International Organization of Migration, like what exactly you meant, because I didn't hear you very well when you mentioned this, and so I couldn't really understand.
No, the idea was simply to just check whatever materials they produce. I remember they produced a lot of materials on international migrations. I mean, that's their job after all, and they normally, it's not just statistics, but also, you know, research papers, and I mean, they have inspired a lot of, I would say, scholarly literature, etc. I wonder whether that may be useful. It may not be. I mean, you have a clear, you know, statistics and methods, training in quantitative methods, etc. in Cambridge, and probably with the material you have, you can sort of juggle around with the you know, figures and the combination of those figures. But I simply wondered whether you had taken that into account.
Yes, yeah. So I've checked like several of those either papers or reports, things like that, and obviously I also relate on some of the official statistics from some of the organizations. So yes, but I think I will have a look. Thank you. Yeah, once again maybe. And yeah, one thing that I wanted to mention is also that, for instance, the data on policies that I use, the data on immigration policies, they are based on different reports from international organizations, things like that. So it's both national and international reports. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe back to your very first point of my personal experience, I think it's a bit difficult for me to actually assess it properly, I think, because what I think was quite influential in my case was that everywhere I went, I was, first of all, I was a student, And second, I was like, let's say, high-skilled immigrant. And I think that, and this is also shown in the research, that attitudes towards high-skilled immigrants and immigrants without any skills are diametrically different. So I don't think it, obviously it depends on the country too. So there are definitely differences between, let's say, my home country, the Czech Republic, and for instance, Canada, that is extremely open towards immigration, and where you can feel very welcome very easily. But in my, like, it's very hard for me to assess my personal situation because I was always in this very privileged like framework. However, maybe here I can mention that when I was still at Sciences Po, I did some qualitative research about second and third generation of migrants, and also with people who arrived to France very young and a long time ago. And this was extremely interesting because some of them were from countries that are at the moment members of the European Union, but because they arrived, for instance, after the Second World War, they arrived as refugees, and their status was extremely different from what they would experience nowadays. So it was very, very interesting to talk with them, to hear their experience, how it was for them to go to another country as refugees at the time, and compare with my own experience. That is actually, for me, it's quite easy to go basically anywhere. And yeah, this was very revealing and interesting, and also on the personal side, very interesting. Sorry.
Excellent. But I mean, now that you have mentioned this idea of the second and third generation migrants, it's I want to simply note that in France, I mean, to me, it's quite strange to talk about third generation migrants. I mean, they have lived there for generations. I mean, these people. Whereas in the United States, they would say, you know, the children of those who migrated are first generation Americans. They're not migrants any longer. I mean, they may have other problems. I'm not entering that area, that you know, blurred or blurry or difficult area. But in any case, they are considered as Americans. And by the way, when I migrated with my family in '85 to London, Spain was not a member of the European, I mean, the European communities, as they were called those days. we joined soon, but I mean, when I arrived there, I had to go to the aliens registration office, and I was issued a paper which said alien, very big. And one of the things they did, my wife came with me to the registration office, and one of the things they did was to wipe out her name, because in Spain we keep women keep their names, and they said, you're not this name any longer, you are Mrs. this other name. You know, the guy that was dealing with us was from the Hindustani Peninsula. He was obviously a citizen, a British citizen, but I was quite confused with this way of treating me. And I said, can I see your supervisor? And because I'm coming here to work for my government, I have nothing to do with migration in Britain or whatever. This is a residence permit, nothing else. And he became quite nervous, saying, this guy's, you know, complaining here about what I'm saying. But this is first an idea of what was before and after belonging to the European Union. I mean, I could go further and tell you the passport with which I left Spain for the first time in '67, which had more exceptions than you know, authorizations to visit countries, because we were forbidden. All the Iron Curtain countries and many others were forbidden to us with that passport. Or when I went to Switzerland in at the beginning of the '70s to work as we were called Ferienaushilfe, you know, help, you know, students, volunteers or whatever. I mean, but we were paid to substitute people who were on holidays or to use our holiday time. Both things applied. a kind of passport, European passport, makes a big difference, as you were saying before. Just it's a way of footnote to your comments.
Thank you. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Jesús. Muchas gracias, Eva. Empezamos también con las preguntas del público. Marie tiene el micrófono y si por aquí al lado alguien quiere comentar algo, vale. Marie, por favor.
Yes, thank you so much, Eva. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think also your findings are politically so relevant because especially of your finding about the lack of a public backlash, because I think politically measures are many times justified with the fear of a public backlash. So I really thought that was very interesting. What I wanted to ask you about, I mean, it's out of pure interest. I'm not a quantitative scientist, but I thought what was really interesting was this jump that you observed between before a policy measure was introduced and after, and in both directions. So I thought it's really interesting that it seemed like such a striking event to introduce a policy. So I was wondering if that's maybe just a matter of the way you depicted the data in your presentation, whether there are sometimes jumps and these can be attributed to events like, for example, introducing a policy, but also maybe sometimes other events that happen that all of a sudden change a lot the way that migration is perceived in a country. So I would be interested in hearing more about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Marie. Yes, so actually, when we observe this jump, I think it is relatively important jump because it's related really to the introduction of this policy. But at the same time, there are obviously events that can create even larger variation in attitudes. We saw this especially with the refugee crisis. So after the 2015, in some countries, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, we could see that attitudes quite dramatically changed towards more restrictive attitudes towards immigration. The measure that I showed here, it varied between -2 and +2. And -2 indicated that people don't want to allow any immigrants into the country at all, whereas 2 indicated that they won't allow many immigrants to come. So you can kind of see the scale, and if the jump is by 0.3 or 0.4, which is what we observed here, you can kind of relate it to how substantial the change is in public attitudes. There is obviously also the question of how durable this change is. And maybe that someone will ask me about this too. I think that this is why I chose really major policies, because I think that if it's very probable that if the policies are on a small scale or like some kind of fine-tuning to an existing policy, people probably don't even know that it happened, and many people probably wouldn't even know that those policies happened, even though there were really major changes very much discussed in the press, especially in the case of Switzerland, where it was like an emergency, and in the case of Sweden, where it was really a group of law very much liberalizing immigration. But obviously you would still have people who have never heard about this. But maybe the combination of the policy and the press coverage of it could create some kind of like information or like some kind of environment where people actually maybe slightly change their position towards this group. So if you talk about immigration as an emergency, like refugees as an emergency crisis, then maybe people start to perceive it as a crisis. If you, on the contrary, say, okay, now we are going to make it easier for people to come and to live here with their families, maybe that immigration doesn't seem to be such a threat. So it's, I think, maybe a combination between the two.
Muchas gracias, Eva.
Jesus also asked for the floor. Here I'm going to moderate on behalf of Jesus because he can't really see us. Thank you very much, Eva. Your work is very interesting. I'm going to be brief because I have a couple of questions. The first one is whether you kept into consideration some contextual variables. You are clearly started taking data from 2012, but we know that the impact from the crisis of 2008 was more outstanding in some countries than in others. And this is a variable that should be kept into account because probably the views on migration is very much connected to the financial crisis and to the recovery processes. So I think that's a very important aspect. Also, when you presented some of the case studies, I was thinking that there is an additional aspect that could be relevant, not only whether they come from Eastern Europe or not. This is something that was mentioned in the discussion here, and that would be to select some border countries, because I think that border countries, the fact that a country is a border country, makes the population more concerned about migration, and I think that's very important. For example, the attitudes or the views in Greece or Spain is not the same as the attitude in France, because we are a border country, and that has an impact in people's views. I think there's a clear difference in Eastern countries, and we have seen this when we analyze data, not only when you talk about migrations, but in other issues. We realize that there are major differences between the countries that were part of the Union previously and those who joined later, those Eastern countries. I was also considering whether you are going to elaborate in those surveys, because I think there's another aspect that can be very relevant too, and that is some social and demographic circumstances of the surveyed people. There are many differences between native Europeans, that is your generation, and those people who lived most of their lives in a context where Europe was not that important. And I think that can be a difference, that can make a difference. I think there would be a difference in political attitudes. And, for example, the European processes and the European aspects really influence the attitudes in a country. I think there's something that's also relevant. This is a quantitative research, but I always say that this quantitative research, although we can extract some conclusions, and if you realize when you try to validate or not validate your outcomes, you find a conclusion of causes. But I would invite you to study more on the causes. It's like when you bake a cake and you have to prick it with a fork to see if it's cooked in the inside. And there are some things that are connected to this. You said that you are working with public policies. That's very accurate. But this general, the basis of migration policies are connected to distinctive policies in each country, either by integration or by differentiation. So establish those characteristics to establish the cases could be very relevant. I think that's all on my side. I think it's passionate, it's very interesting. However, I think it would be interesting to define in a more specific or concrete way some variables that may have an impact in that correlation that you are attempting to establish between the policies and the attitudes. We don't have that much time left. I don't know if there's going to be any additional question. We have 5-7 minutes. We're going to reduce the coffee break, but we're going to try to make the most of this session.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. All of them are absolutely relevant, so thank you. I will maybe start from the beginning. So when you talk about, for instance, the economic condition, the influence of economic crisis, this is actually something that I do take into account. So when I do the overall evolution of attitudes towards immigration, I also take into account the economic conditions and the share of immigrants in the country. What I don't do is that I don't compare countries between them, but because each of them represents a very specific case, and I think it is quite problematic to actually compare countries between them. But to assess the influence of the economic conditions, of the share of immigrants, and of public policies, I look at the change over time within countries, and this allows me to keep the context quite at least similar a little bit in the same country, but to see the effect of those factors over time. So, but you are absolutely right that the economic crisis is very important, and it's also one of the reasons why I used the data since 1990 until 2019 to actually see the kind of not so long term, but a little bit longer period that could be seen in the ESS data. When it comes to your second point, I would love to do this, really. I think it would be really great, but I actually don't find any immigration policies that took place during the field work of the ESS in those border countries, unfortunately. So the 4 policies that I presented, the 4 cases, these are the only one that took place during the field work, so when the individuals were interviewed for the survey. So I could do a smaller analysis of specific case in the border countries, but I couldn't do this cause identification because I don't have the data for it, unfortunately. But I agree with you, absolutely, it would be amazing to do. Hopefully, there will be a possibility with some future rounds of the survey. The third point is extremely relevant, obviously. So the socio-economic characteristics of individuals this has probably the biggest influence on their attitudes towards immigration. How I actually treat this is that in the case studies, I have a representative sample of the population before and after the policy, so it should be representative of the overall composition of the population, including the socioeconomic backgrounds. I don't look at individual attitudes towards immigration. I really look on the aggregate attitudes before and after the policy. And since it's a representative sample, I believe that it should be representative of the overall attitude in the society. But you are absolutely right. Then when we look at differences in attitudes between individuals, their social economic characteristics, their life experience, the context they grew up in plays a major role in determining their attitudes towards immigration. And finally, I think that okay, now I see what you meant. This is an excellent point, and I will definitely include it in the paper. I think it would really benefit from it. So it would be interesting to see those specificities of public policies towards immigration in each country. So yeah, this is definitely a good, excellent point. Thank you.
Gracias, Eva. Y ya de manera rápida.
Thank you, Eva. And very quickly, to wrap up, Mrs. Rosa Maria Martinez de Code.
Thank you, Eva. Well, I'm going to ask you in English because you come from England. Thank you, Eva, for your, I think it's a splendid, well-structured presentation. I appreciate it. And as far as you refer to public policies, my question has to do with some indicators that I didn't hear in your presentation. Probably you study them, but I think it changed public policies. My indicators have to do with the age pyramid in the European Union. I mean, how we call it socio-demographic, okay? how we are getting older in the European Union and how there is a change of new people coming into Europe, right? Then the second one has to do with the foresee of how these young people coming from different countries are going to, to substitute the lack of handwork in our countries. I mean, there is a triangular connection between that sort of old aging, right? New generations coming into Europe, and how we are going to, how they are going to be in that post that they are now needed. I remember that Germany in 2016, I remember 16, you can confirm or not, they accepted 1 million immigrants, near 1 million immigrants. That was a calculation of the needs they have. My point is, if in the European Union, there is a public policy concerning all these indicators for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. Yes, absolutely. This is extremely relevant, and it's also one of the reasons why immigration policies in Europe are still they are still evolving towards more liberal policies, specifically because countries they need to. As you said, they need the handwork. They also want to attract talent, so they want to attract high-skilled immigrants. Yes, so this is one of the major factors contributing to the evolution in the attitudes we see, and also so this is from the point of view of public policies. But also when we look at public attitudes towards immigration, some people argued that older people have more negative attitudes towards immigration, and this could be true to some extent. But also some other recent research shows that older people can be actually quite open towards immigration because they know that they need immigrants to have someone who will care for them in the care homes and in other public services. So I think it's the openness of immigration policies is actually always a combination of being a pragmatic policymaker and possibly introducing also some solidarity measures. But I would say recently a lot of policies introduced were really with this pragmatic view of needing workers and attracting talent. So, yeah, I think I will specify this maybe further in the paper because it's a very important point and a very good comment. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jesús. Pues hasta aquí, más que nada porque la hora se nos ha llegado. Jesús, si quieres hacer algún comentario final.
No, I thank very much Eva for her presentation, for her answers that have been quite to the point and very complete, and I would be glad to read the final paper when it is ready. All the best in this itinerary that is before you. Okay, and you will adjourn the meeting, Miguel, right? Or will I adjourn it formally?
Sí, bueno, nosotros ahora vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa. Yo sé que tú vas a estar ahí y vas a continuar siguiéndonos y esperemos.
Yes, we're going to break for coffee, and I know you are going to follow the rest of the meeting. You will be there, and I hope you will be able to meet us in person for the final presentations when the students handle the final presentations. Thank you.